Welcome back, everybody. Well, the people have spoken, and you have overwhelmingly voted over on Patreon for us to take a look at Extra Histories series on Grigori Rasputin. So I'm excited to dive into this one. I know a little bit about Rasputin's story, and we've covered it here and there in videos about the Russian Revolution and things like that. This is a story of manipulation. It's a story of how people respond to fear, especially fear over their children. It's a story about like sex scandals and intrigue and the way that the media gets involved and how public perception can impact things, and how one person being connected at the highest levels can help drive an entire empire toward anarchy and war. It's all of that stuff. So I'm excited to dive into this one. We're going to take a look at part one today. As always, I'll put the link in the description to the original content over at Extra History. Please make sure that you give them a like and a subscribe if you haven't already. By far the channel that I do the most reactions to, because I like how they do things. I like the way they tell a story. I think it's easy to follow. I think it's presented well, and I'm excited to dive into this one. So let's go ahead and do it.
Winter Palace, St. Petersburg, May 6th, 1917. The hammers of the typewriter crash down on the page. Extraordinary Commission of Inquiry for the investigation of illegal acts by ministers and other responsible persons of the Tsarist regime. Anna, once a maid of honor to the Empress of Russia, nervously wrings her hands. She sits in the throne room, but there's no longer a throne in it. The wallpaper has been torn down, just like the Tsar. Anna, you see, has been brought here from prison. Across from her, the interrogator smokes, and when the typist is ready, he begins to ask questions. He wants to know about the Tsar and Tsarina, their contacts with occultists and mesmerists, but especially about one man. How, he wants to know, did the imperial family meet Rasputin?
And that's the thing about this whole story, is that had this guy not gotten the connection that he got to the Tsarina especially, and if you're not familiar, the Tsarina is the wife of the Tsar. She's the Empress. In this case, she happens to be, I believe, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. So that's going to be an important part of this story, because it's through descendants of Queen Victoria that we're going to see the hemophiliac, the gene that causes hemophilia, get passed down. And that's going to become an important part of this story.
Thanks so much to World Anvil for helping us forge today's historical tale. If there's one character from Russian history everybody knows, it's Grigori Rasputin. Arguably more famous than the Tsar and Tsarina he served, his reputation for occult powers and debauchery has transcended the historical reality of his life, transforming him into everything from a horror movie villain, to a comic book character, to a beer mascot, to the subject matter of that amazing Boney M song we riffed with as our April Fool's episode.
If you've seen the movie The King's Man that just came out, it's a prequel to the Kingsman series, Rasputin's a big part of it, and boy, they've got him down. I mean, the guy that plays him looks like him, and he's got the actions and the personality, and actually a decent part of the story, even though they're inserting a fictionalized version of it, it actually gets a lot of his demise pretty accurate, interestingly, because the British may have been involved in there.
I mean, let's not kid ourselves. That song slaps. After all, who can resist the story of a mad monk who brought down a dynasty? But did he? See, Rasputin became involved with the Tsar at a pivotal moment in Russian history. Just as Nicholas II lost his aristocratic powers, and the monarchy entered a tailspin into war and revolution. And Rasputin became seen in political circles and the press as either the cause of the royals' detachment and decline, or a symptom.
And that poses a great question, an interesting what if. What if this whole thing had happened 20 years earlier? What if Rasputin came along 20 years earlier? We might not have ever even heard of him, because first of all, there's no Tsarevich, Alexei, the heir to the throne, which is kind of Rasputin's in with the Tsarina and therefore with the Tsar himself. There's no World War I going on, and so you don't have this complication of other things happening. I think Rasputin is just somebody we never even hear about if he comes along 20 years sooner, but he comes along at this conflux of events, at this time when all of these things are going downhill at the same time, and he just becomes one more thing that pushes the monarchy into non-existence in Russia.
Death, too, only enhanced his legend. Because once the Tsar abdicated and the country barreled towards revolution, the dead Rasputin served as a convenient way for monarchists and royal advisors to shift blame for the Tsar's poor decisions away from themselves. Even our understanding of Rasputin's assassination comes from the, let's just say, dubious accounts of his killers. In other words, Rasputin is surrounded by a cloud of myth. But like many tales from history, the true story is far more incredible.
And this makes another good point that we talk about all the time on this channel, and that is that when we're studying history, it's always important to understand the sources. First of all, know what the sources are and what they're saying, and they very rarely are always going to agree. Eyewitnesses very rarely agree, even though they might see the same event. But also you have to ask a lot of questions. What is this person's motivation in telling this version of the story? What are they hoping to accomplish? Who are they talking to? And all of those things factor into, and how close were they to these events? Were they an eyewitness? Are they hearing it from someone else? Do they have a reason to lie? Do they have a reason to embellish this? What purpose would it serve for them in doing so? There's all kinds of things we have to ask. You just can't say, well, they wrote it down, it must be true. And we have to ask those questions when it comes to Rasputin, too.
The man who would walk in imperial palaces and serve an emperor was born in January 1869 in the Siberian village of Pokrovska. And we know about as much of Rasputin's childhood as we do about most Siberian peasants from the time.
Nothing.
Which is to say, almost nothing. His family was illiterate, and Grigori would remain so until his 20s. And though political enemies would later...
And that's not unusual. That's not unusual in any part of the world at this time. In fact, I want to take a look at some statistics about this. What was the literacy rate like in the late 1800s in some of these major countries around the world? Okay, so I'll try to zoom in on this when I'm editing, but just taking a look here. Here's ourworldindata.org. And according to this, if we go to, let's say, 1900, the world literacy rate was 21%. So 21% of those 14 years of age and older could read and write. If you look at data, like, for example, the U.S. Census always recorded starting, I think, in like the late 1800s. They recorded in the every 10 years in the census whether or not people could read or write. And listen, if you didn't have a job that required it, by and large, you probably didn't. I mean, if you were a farmer, if you were even a steel worker, there was no reason you had to be able to read or write. And you know, even my own great-grandparents, a few of them could only sign their names, and that was about it. So we do have some data on Russia. So let's take a look at them for a second. So in Russia, that's Costa Rica. That doesn't help me. Here we go. So in Russia in 1870, so that's right about the time Rasputin's born, literacy rate's 15%. And you could probably assume that the majority of that was not in Siberia. So probably a very, very tiny. But look at the United Kingdom at 76%. So you can see the difference from one very industrialized Western power like the UK, 76%, to Russia where it's only 15%, where you have largely an agrarian, very rural economy, and you don't have a lot of people in cities and working in factories and those kinds of things. So Russia's right near the world average, which is 19% at that time.
Claimed that he was a horse thief. Local records from the time indicate his wild youth never rose above public drunkenness, petty theft, and insubordination toward local officials. At 18, he married a peasant woman, and a decade later, things hadn't really changed much. He was 28, illiterate, living with his father, only now he had 3 children. But all in all, a completely ordinary background. Then, one day, he just kind of left. Now later he would claim to have seen a religious vision, an icon of the Virgin Mary weeping, but it also may have been a more mundane cause, like a crisis of faith or simply an urge to travel.
This is a really interesting question because, you know, I can only speak for myself and experience I've had with others. I think typically in our mid-20s is about the time we start developing into the person that we're going to become. Now, that doesn't mean that things don't change, but you would think by the time a guy's 28, married with 3 children, he's pretty well settled in his path. You're not typically going to see a drastic change in someone, especially someone like Grigori Rasputin, where we see him just kind of go off the deep end. There doesn't appear to be a lot of signs of that early in his life. So something happened. Something dramatic happened that changed the course of this guy's life.
Whatever the reason, in 1897, he set off to walk to a monastery of St. Nicholas, where he claimed to have studied under the local starets, a term for a spiritual elder who'd attained holiness through spare living and deep meditation. Presumably, this was where Rasputin learned to read, though he declined to stay in the monastery. Monastic life would have meant giving others authority over him, and Rasputin was always wary of that. So instead, he took to the road as a wandering pilgrim, which was a surprisingly popular life choice for men in 19th century Russia. Those seeking spiritual enlightenment, or even just travel and excitement, would simply walk across country to whatever place of pilgrimage they set as a goal.
Which is kind of fascinating, especially in a country like Russia that's huge and sparsely populated, especially in places like Siberia. That probably involved a lot of walking.
People of all classes did it, traveling in groups and occasionally practicing self-mortification by wearing shackles or engaging in other forms of discomfort.
So why would people do that? Well, I can't necessarily speak to the Russian culture or to even the Russian Orthodox Church, but this is actually a pretty common thing in religious circles. Speaking as a Christian, there are some who take very seriously the idea of identifying with Christ in his suffering. In this case being his suffering on the cross. And so a way to identify more with Jesus was to suffer yourself. In the Middle Ages, people would do things like wear a hair shirt, which was the shirt that would go on underneath their regular, very fancy, very comfortable clothing. It was super uncomfortable. Like imagine wearing a really itchy wool directly against your skin all the time. It was meant to keep you uncomfortable. Fasting is another example of that happens among religious people these days. These are ways of giving something up or allowing yourself to feel uncomfortable so that you can better identify with Jesus in this case.
Now, personally, Rasputin found shackles distracting. Instead, he tried wearing the same shirt for a year at a time without removing it, walking to shrines and monasteries through heat and cold.
Now, the problem here is that you're not making yourself uncomfortable. You're making everybody else uncomfortable, too, because if you're wearing the same shirt for a year and a half, people are going to smell you. People are going to be turned off by you. And this is something that often was attributed to Rasputin. There was this kind of lack of personal hygiene, which is fascinating when you consider the charisma and the power he seemed to have over people.
Dodging brigands and meeting fellow pilgrims. Stinky, but far more comfy. He did this on and off for years, even claiming to have walked to Mount Athos in Greece, which, if he started at home, would be roughly like walking from New York to Los Angeles. Whew, my dogs are barking just thinking about that. And it was on one of these journeys that he began to feel a bit of his own power. Back on the home front, however, his family felt that the Grigori who had left for the monastery of St. Nicholas was not the one who came back. Now he prayed with an ecstatic fervor that was entrancing to watch, and moved with a new confidence even among the upper class. He stared directly at people with an intensity that they never forgot, and seemed to have an ability to read someone at first meeting, understanding what they wanted, how best to talk to them.
And what's unfortunate about this is that the guy genuinely had charisma, and he genuinely had some gifts when it came to understanding people and connecting with people. Unfortunately, it seems like he chose to use these gifts for himself, to get himself ahead, to get what he wanted, and to take advantage of people. Imagine if he had used those same abilities from a desire to help people. And this is true throughout history. Some people use the gifts and abilities they have only for themselves. Others use it to better the world around them, to better their nation, to better their families. And, there are different ways of becoming great and becoming well-known and remembered. And people take different paths to do that.
Within a few years, he was leading a prayer group in Pokrovska, which met in a friend's fruit cellar. There, Rasputin's followers, mostly his family and a few locals, sang hymns of his own creation and spoke about God. But not everyone was happy with Rasputin. A local priest tried to warn others away from the pilgrim, who, after all, was not a priest, by the way, and some said that female followers were washing his body before worship. Plus, there were rumors that he had become linked with the Klaisti, a much older sect known for flagellation and accused of sexual rites that the Orthodox Church deemed heretical.
And the flagellation thing's another one that was a common thing throughout history. People like Thomas More, who's an ancestor of my wife, who's well known from the Henry VIII story. He was Henry VIII's chancellor and advisor. He was somebody who would whip himself. That's what flagellation is. But, you know, a lot of times people with power, like I said, use this to their own ends. And you'll see this a lot of times in cults where sex becomes a part of that cult. And David Koresh, for example, with the Branch Davidians down in Waco, Texas, back in the 90s, used his power and influence over people to get what he wanted in those situations.
But nonetheless, his fame grew, and people started coming to see him. By 1904, he was taking trips to a nearby city where he was welcomed as a starets himself, known for acting as a spiritual advisor for any who came to him. And he was rumored to be able to heal people with prayer, part of a long-standing tradition in Russia of holy men able to perform miracles. While there, he began meeting figures in the Orthodox Church who were so impressed with his saintliness that they sent him to St. Petersburg with a letter of introduction. Now,
and this is key. Sometimes you need that connection. During the American Revolutionary War, Benjamin Franklin was giving these things out to people because what would happen is people would come from Prussia, for example, people like Baron von Steuben, or from France, where Benjamin Franklin was in France as an ambassador, people like Marquis de Lafayette, and they would go to Franklin and they would say, hey, give me a letter of introduction to your Congress and a recommendation so I can get a commission as a general in the American Army. I want to help out. And so these people would show up, and there was people constantly showing up in America with letters from people like Ben Franklin to get those connections. A letter of introduction was an important way of, these are the days before the internet. You couldn't Google somebody and find out their credentials. Watch YouTube videos to see if they performed well. You had to hear from people you trusted. People would show up at the court of Henry VIII with a letter of introduction from, say, a monk at some monastery, or from the rector of some church, or from the head of some cathedral, introducing them to the Archbishop of Canterbury and saying, hey, use this guy. This was a very common thing, and he took advantage of that. Like I said, there's got to be some qualities about this man that impressed people that allowed him to kind of work his way up to these connections.
Now, what exactly Rasputin was supposed to do in the capital is still up for debate. He claimed to be raising money for a church, though he dropped that idea pretty quickly once he arrived. And instead, he went to parties. See, when he arrived in St. Petersburg, he quickly fell in with an archbishop named Theophan, who had a tendency to collect firebrand right-wing preachers around him. He liked to bring these men into aristocratic salons to nudge the political and religious conversation. There was the ultra-nationalist Bishop Hermogenes, for example, who'd reportedly castrated himself in his 30s and kicked a young Joseph Stalin out of seminary.
Interesting. And yeah, that's important to note. Joseph Stalin, that wasn't his name. Stalin is Russian for steel, or maybe George. I don't know, because he's Georgian, he's not Russian. But how differently that path could have gone if he'd have gone into ministry instead. But this is, this kind of thing happened. People, again, religious fervor. They read, there's a scripture where Jesus said, if your right arm causes you to sin, cut it off. Some people took that quite literally rather than figuratively. And so, for example, the guy, Boston Corbett, who was this soldier who was responsible for shooting and killing John Wilkes Booth, the man who killed Abraham Lincoln, did this to himself later on in life when he kind of went off the deep end.
Also, there was the monk Iliador, who advocated for deporting all foreigners and wrote deranged pamphlets about how international cabals of Jews and Freemasons were trying to topple the Tsar. It was this incredibly normal and rational circle that Rasputin ended up joining, and they became some of his earliest supporters. Though in truth, he would quickly outshine them all. Because the bored aristocrats of St. Petersburg saw something in Rasputin. His sincerity and religious ecstasy was raw, vital, and exciting. His gray-green eyes bore into you when you met him, and he seemed to just know what you were thinking,
And the thing about the eyes, let me show you a picture of Rasputin, because even in a black and white picture from 100 years ago, you can see that. You can really kind of get a sense of that way he stared into people. So here's a few pictures that we have of him. Here's one. This one here, it's colorized. It gives you a little bit more of a sense of it. But this one, especially, but I think that's the one that really kind of you like just get a sense of, okay, this guy's creepy, but also very intriguing and interesting. And, you can just tell there's just something about the guy that really is fascinating.
And despite his peasant upbringing, he never appeared intimidated by titles or wealth. In fact, his appearance and rough manners added to his mystique, at a time when few aristocrats had seen a Siberian peasant, much less spoken to one. Rasputin appeared exotic and a little threatening.
Yeah, so a lot of people, you'll find that a lot. And here's what happens. People who liked him ignored the stuff that drove other people nuts. They consider, oh, it's quaint, oh, he's Siberian, oh, he doesn't know any better, isn't it cute the way he does those things? People who kind of saw through that and didn't like him saw it for what they felt it was, which was manipulation and dirty and bad manners and out of line and stuff like that. And we do that, don't we? We excuse things in people if we otherwise want to like them or if we have a reason why we want to keep them around. And we'll ignore those things. And a lot of people did that. You'll hear that from a lot of people that were within the palace and those circles, is that they kind of brushed that stuff off and were like, oh, all that stuff that we look back now and say, the guy was nuts. Those people were like, oh, it's cute, it's quaint, he doesn't know any better.
Part of the real Russia, the Europeanized upper class had lost touch with. When he spoke about faith, it felt grounded and alive. And the way he talked to these aristocrats, touched and stroked their hands, particularly ladies' hands, well, people found it simultaneously provoking, repellent, and magnetic. But just to be clear, Rasputin was certainly not the only mystic running in high circles at the time. In fact, the Russian aristocracy was awash in occultists, mesmerists, spirit mediums, and supposed prophets.
So again, Rasputin could have just been another one of those people that we never heard about if it hadn't been for the time and place and the people he connected with. And that was what set him apart from the rest of them.
These figures increasingly appealed to Russia's upper class, who had become disengaged from Orthodox Christianity and began experimenting with new religious ideas. This ran the gamut from a young Prince Yusupov, who we'll return to later in this story, believing he'd acquired clairvoyant powers, to the composer Alexander Scriabin using occult themes in his music, believing if they were played correctly, it could end the world. So, yeah, Rasputin slid nicely into this environment, and as his reputation as a prophet and healer increased, some of his aristocratic contacts decided to introduce him to a new couple who had a great interest in miracle workers, Nicholas and Alexandra, the Emperor and Empress of Russia. They had been without a mystical advisor for some years now, ever since government ministers had forced them to send their last favorite, a French miracle worker, into exile. And Theophan, as well as the occult circles of St. Petersburg, thought they'd found the perfect replacement. So Rasputin, the Siberian peasant, entered the royal circle.
And I can see Royal Bloods where we're going to get into the story of Prince Alexei. And we'll talk more about that tomorrow. But man, when it comes to your kids, people will do crazy things if they think it'll help protect their kid, keep their kid safe, keep them alive. I got a lot of sympathy for Nicholas and Alexandra because of that. But we'll talk about that more tomorrow. Let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. Let me know something you learned you didn't know today. And if you have something to add to this part of the conversation, what we've talked about so far, don't get ahead. We'll get to the rest of the story. But let me know your thoughts if there's something you can add to the conversation. Let's learn together. Please hit that like button if you would. We'll come back tomorrow with the next episode. Thanks for watching.